The Refutation of Idealism, which is a paper, an article by G.E. Moore, published in Mind in 1903. So he's starting the refutation by saying that modern idealism, if it asserts any general conclusion about the universe at all, asserts that it is spiritual. There are 2 points about this assertion to which I wish to call attention. These points are that whatever be its exact meaning, it is certainly meant, one, that the universe is very different indeed from what it seems, and two, that it has quite a large number of properties which it does not seem to have. Chairs and tables and mountains seem to be very different from us, but when the whole universe is declared to be spiritual, it is certainly meant to assert that they are far more like us than we think. The idealist means to assert that they are in some sense neither lifeless nor unconscious, as they certainly seem to be, and I do not think his language is so grossly deceptive, but that we may assume him to believe that they really are very different indeed from what they seem. And secondly, when he declares that they are spiritual, he means to include in that term quite a large number of different properties. When the whole universe is declared to be spiritual, it is meant not only that it is in some sense conscious, but that it has what we recognize in ourselves as the higher forms of consciousness. That it is intelligent, that it is purposeful, that it is not mechanical. All these different things are commonly asserted of it. In general, it may be said this phrase, reality is spiritual, excites and expresses the belief that the whole universe possesses all the qualities the possession of which is held to make us so superior to things which seem to be inanimate. At least if it does not possess exactly those which we possess, it possesses not one only but several others, which by the same ethical standard would be judged equal to or better than our own. When we say it is spiritual, we mean to say that it has quite a number of excellent qualities different from any which we commonly attribute either to stars or planets or to cups and saucers. Now, why I mention these 2 points is that when engaged in the intricacies of philosophic discussion, we are apt to overlook the vastness of the difference between this idealistic view and the ordinary view of the world, and to overlook the number of different propositions which the idealist must prove. It is, I think, owing to the vastness of this difference and owing to the number of different excellencies which idealists attribute to the universe that it seems such an interesting and important question whether idealism be true or not. But when we begin to argue about it, I think we are apt to forget what a vast number of arguments this interesting question must involve. We are apt to assume that if 1 or 2 points be made on either side, the whole case is won. I say this lest it should be thought that any of the arguments which will be advanced in this paper would be sufficient to disprove, or any refutation of them sufficient to prove, the truly interesting and important proposition that reality is spiritual. For my own part, I wish it to be clearly understood that I do not suppose that anything I shall say has the smallest tendency to prove that reality is not spiritual. I do not believe it possible to refute a single one of the many important propositions contained in the assertion that it is so. Reality may be spiritual for all I know, and I devotedly hope it is, but I take idealism to be a wide term and to include not only this interesting conclusion but a number of arguments which are supposed to be, if not sufficient, at least necessary to prove it. Indeed, I take it that modern idealists are chiefly distinguished by certain arguments which they have in common. That reality is spiritual has, I believe, been the tenet of many theologians, and yet for believing that alone they should hardly be called idealist. There are besides, I believe, many persons not improperly called idealists who hold certain characteristic propositions without venturing to think them quite sufficient to prove so grand a conclusion. It is therefore only with idealistic arguments that I am concerned. And if any idealist holds that no argument is necessary to prove that reality is spiritual, I shall certainly not have refuted him. I shall, however, attack at least one argument, which, to the best of my belief, is considered necessary to their proposition by all idealists. And I wish to point out a certain advantage which this procedure gives me, an advantage which justifies the assertion that if my arguments are sound, they will have refuted idealism. If I can refute a single proposition, which is a necessary and essential step in all idealistic arguments, then no matter how good the rest of these arguments may be, I shall have proved that idealists have no reason whatever for their conclusion. Suppose we have a chain of argument which takes the form, since A is B and B is C and C is D, it follows A is D. In such an argument, though B is C and C is D may both be perfectly true, yet if A is B be false, we have no more reason for asserting A is D than if all three were false. It does not indeed follow that A is D is false, nor does it follow that no other arguments would prove it to be true, but it does follow that, so far as this argument goes, it is the barest supposition, without the least bit of evidence. I propose to attack a proposition which seems to me to stand in this relation to the conclusion, reality is spiritual. I do not propose to dispute that reality is spiritual. I do not deny that there may be reasons for thinking that it is, but I do propose to show that one reason upon which, to the best of my judgment, all other arguments ever used by idealists depend is false. These other arguments may, for all I shall say, be eminently ingenious and true. They are very many and various, and different idealists use the most different arguments to prove the same most important conclusions. Some of these may be sufficient to prove that B is C and C is D, but if, as I shall try to show, their A is B is false, the conclusion A is D remains a pleasant supposition. I do not deny that to suggest pleasant and possible supposition may be the proper function of philosophy, but I am assuming that the name idealism can only be properly applied where there is a certain amount of argument intended to be cogent. The subject of this paper is therefore quite uninteresting. Even if I prove my point, I shall have proved nothing about the universe in general. Upon the important question whether reality is or is not spiritual, my argument will not have the remotest bearing. I shall only attempt to arrive at the truth about a matter which is in itself quite trivial and insignificant, and from which, so far as I can see, and certainly so far as I shall say, no conclusions can be drawn about any of the subjects about which we most want to know. The only importance I can claim for the subject I shall investigate is that it seems to me to be a matter upon which not idealists only but all philosophers and psychologists also have been in error, and from their erroneous view of which they have inferred, validly or invalidly, their most striking and interesting conclusions, and that it has even this importance I cannot hope to prove. If it has this importance, it will indeed follow that all the most striking results of philosophy, sensationalism, agnosticism, and idealism alike have, for all that has hitherto been urged in their favor no more foundation than the supposition that a chimera lives in the moon. It will follow that unless new reasons never urged hitherto can be found, all the most important philosophic doctrines have as little claim to assent as the most superstitious beliefs of the lowest savages. Upon the question what we have reason to believe in the most interesting matters, I do, therefore, think that my results will have an important bearing, but I cannot too clearly insist that upon the question whether these beliefs are true, they will have none whatever. The trivial proposition which I propose to dispute is this, that SA is percipi. This is a very ambiguous proposition, but in some sense or other, it has been very widely held that it is in some sense essential to idealism. I must for the present merely assume what I propose to show is that in all the senses ever given to it, it is false. But first of all, it may be useful to point out briefly in what relation I conceive it to stand to idealistic arguments that wherever you can truly predicate SA, you can truly predicate percipi in some sense or other is, I take it, a necessary step in all arguments, properly to be called idealistic. And what is more, in all arguments hitherto offered for the idealistic conclusion, if SA is percipi, this is at once equivalent to saying that whatever is experienced. And this again is equivalent in a sense to saying that whatever is something mental. But this is not the sense in which the idealist conclusion must maintain that reality is mental. The idealist conclusion is that SA is percipio, and hence whether SA be percipio or not, a further and different discussion is needed to show whether or not it is also percipio. And again, even if SA be percipio, we need a vast quantity of further argument to show that what has SA has also those higher mental qualities which are denoted by spiritual. This is why I said that the question I should discuss, namely whether or not SA is percipi, must be utterly insufficient either to prove or to disprove that reality is spiritual. But on the other hand, I believe that every argument ever used to show that reality is spiritual has inferred this, validly or invalidly, from SA's percipio as one of its premises, and that this again has never been pretended to be proved except by use of the premise that SA is percipi. The type of argument used for the latter purpose is familiar enough. It is said that since whatever is experienced, and since some things are which are not experienced by the individual, these must at least form part of some experience. Or again, that since an object necessarily implies a subject, and since the whole world must be an object, we must conceive it to belong to some subject or subjects in the same sense in which whatever is the object of our experience belongs to us. Or again, that since thought enters into the essence of all reality, we must conceive behind it, in it, or as its essence, a spirit akin to us, who think that spirit greets spirit in its object. Into the validity of these inferences I do not propose to enter. They obviously require a great deal of discussion. I only desire to point out that, however correct they may be, yet if SA is not percipi, they leave us as far from a proof that reality is spiritual as if they were all false too. But now, is SA percipi? There are three very ambiguous terms in this proposition, and I must begin by distinguishing the different things that may be meant by some of them. And first, with regard to percipi. This term need not trouble us long at present. It was perhaps originally used to mean sensation only, but I am not going to be so unfair to modern idealists, the only idealist to whom the term should now be applied without qualification, as to hold that if they say essays percipi, they mean by percipi sensation only. On the contrary, I quite agree with them that if SA be percipi at all, percipi must be understood to include not sensation only, but that other type of mental fact which is called thought. And whether essay be percipi or not, I consider it to be the main service of the philosophic school to which modern idealists belong, that they have insisted on distinguishing sensation and thought and on emphasizing the importance of the latter. Against sensationalism and empiricism, they have maintained the true view, but the distinction between sensation and thought need not detain us here, for in whatever respects they differ, they have at least this in common, that they are both forms of consciousness, or to use a term that seems to be more in fashion just now, they are both ways of experiencing. Accordingly, whatever essays percipy may mean, it does at least assert that whatever is experienced. Accordingly, whatever essays percipy may mean, it does at least assert that whatever is experienced. And since what I wish to maintain is that even this is untrue, the question whether it be experienced by way of sensation or thought or both is for my purpose quite irrelevant. If it be not experienced at all, it cannot be either an object of thought or an object of sense. It is only if being involves experience that the question whether it involves sensation or thought or both becomes important. I beg therefore that percipi may be understood in what follows to refer merely to what is common to sensation and thought. A very recent article states the meaning of essays percipi with all desirable clearness in so far as percipi is concerned. I will undertake to show, says Mr. Taylor, that what makes any piece of fact real can be nothing but its presence as an inseparable aspect of a sentient experience. I am glad to think that Mr. Taylor has been in time to supply me with so definite a statement that this is the ultimate premise of idealism. My paper will at least refute Mr. Taylor's idealism, if it refutes anything at all, for I shall undertake to show that what makes a thing real cannot possibly be its presence as an inseparable aspect of a sentient experience. But Mr. Taylor's statement, though clear I think with regard to the meaning of percipi, is highly ambiguous in other respects. I will leave it for the present to consider the next ambiguity in the statement. Essays percipi. What does the copula mean? What can be meant by saying that essays percipi? There are just three meanings, one or other of which a statement must have if it is to be true, and of these there is only one which it can have if it is to be important. 1. The statement may be meant to assert that the word essay is used to signify nothing either more or less than the word percipi, that the two words are precise synonyms, that they are merely different names for one and the same thing, that what is meant by essay is absolutely identical with what is meant by percipi. I think I need not prove that the principal essays percipi is not thus intended merely to define a word, nor yet that, if it were, it would be an extremely bad definition. But if it does not mean this, only two alternatives remain. The second is that what is meant by essay, though not absolutely identical with what is meant by percipi, yet includes the letter as a part of its meaning. If this were the meaning of essays percipi, then to say that a thing was real would not be the same thing as to say that it was experienced. That it was real would mean that it was experienced and something else besides. Being experienced would be analytically essential to reality, but would not be the whole meaning of the term. From the From the fact that a thing was real, we should be able to infer by the law of contradiction that it was experienced, since the latter would be part of what is meant by the former. But on the other hand, from the fact that a thing was experienced, we should not be able to infer that it was real, since it would not follow from the fact that it had one of the attributes essential to reality, that it also had the other or others. Now, if we understand essays percipi in this second sense, we must distinguish three different things which it asserts. First of all, it gives the definition of the word reality, asserting that that word stands for a complex whole, of which what is meant by percipi forms a part, and secondly, it asserts that being experienced forms a part of a certain whole. Both these propositions may be true, and at all events, I do not wish to dispute them. I do not, indeed, think that the word reality is commonly used to include percipi. But I do not wish to argue about the meaning of words, and that many things which are experienced are also something else, that to be experienced forms part of certain wholes, is of course indisputable. But what I wish to point out is that neither of these propositions is of any importance unless we add to them a third, that real is a convenient name for a union of attributes which sometimes occur. It could not be worth anyone's while to assert. No inferences of any importance could be drawn from such an assertion. Our principle could be drawn from such an assertion. Our principle could only mean that when a thing happens to have percipi as well as the other qualities included under SA, it has percipi, and we should never be able to infer that it was experienced, except from a proposition which already asserted that it was both experienced and something else. Accordingly, if the assertion that percipi forms part of the whole meant by reality is to have any importance, it must mean that the whole is organic, at least in this sense, that the other constituent or constituents of it cannot occur without percipi, even if percipi can occur without them. Let us call these other constituents X. The proposition that SA includes percipi and that therefore from SA percipi can be inferred can only be important if it is meant to assert that percipi can be inferred from X. The only importance of the question whether the whole SA includes the part percipi rests, therefore, on the question whether the part X is necessarily connected with the part percipi. And this is the third possible meaning of the assertion SA is percipi, and as we now see, the only important one. SA is percipi asserts that wherever you have X, you also have percipi. That whatever has the property X also has a property that it is experienced, and this being so, it will be convenient if for the future I may be allowed to use the term SA to denote X alone. I do not wish thereby to beg the question whether what we commonly mean by the word real does or does not include percipi as well as X. I am quite content that my definition of SA to denote X should be regarded merely as an arbitrary verbal definition. Whether it is so or not, the only question of interest is whether from X percipi can be inferred, and I should prefer to be able to express this in the form, can percipi be inferred from SA? Only let it be understood that when I say SA, that term will not for the future include percipi. It denotes only that X, which idealists perhaps rightly include along with percipi under their term SA. That there is such an X, they must admit on pain of making the proposition an absolute tautology, and that from this X percipi can be inferred, they must admit, on pain of making it a perfectly barren analytic proposition. Whether X alone should or should not be called SA is not worth a dispute. What is worth dispute is whether percipi is necessarily connected with X. We have therefore discovered the ambiguity of the copula in SA is percipi so far as to see that this principle asserts two distinct terms to be so related that whatever has the one which I call SA has also the property that it is experienced. It asserts a necessary connection between SA on the one hand and percipi on the other. These two words denoting each a distinct term, and SA denoting a term in which that denoted by percipi is not included. We have then in SA's percipi a necessary synthetic proposition, which I have undertaken to refute, and I may say at once that understood as such it cannot be refuted. If the idealist chooses to assert that it is merely a self-evident truth, I have only to say that it does not appear to me to be so, but I believe that no idealist ever has maintained it to be so. Although this, that two distinct terms are necessarily related is the only sense which essays specify can have if it is to be true and important. It can have another sense if it is to be an important falsehood. I believe that idealists all hold this important falsehood. They do not perceive that essays specify must, if true, be merely a self-evident synthetic truth. They either identify with it or give as a reason for it another proposition which must be false because it is self-contradictory. Unless they did so, they would have to admit that it was a perfectly unfounded assumption. And if they recognized that it was unfounded, I do not think they would maintain its truth to be evident. Essays specify in the sense I have found for it may indeed be true. I cannot refute it, but if this sense were clearly apprehended, no one, I think, would believe that it was true. Idealists, we have seen, must assert that whatever is experienced is necessarily so, and this doctrine they commonly express by saying that the object of experience is inconceivable apart from the subject. I have hitherto been concerned with pointing out what meaning this assertion must have if it is to be an important truth. I now propose to show that it may have an important meaning which must be false because it is self contradictory.